Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear viewers and listeners, Assalamu alaikum. In this monologue, I am going to discuss two grave sins and rank them in the light of wisdom provided by the glorious Quran. These sins are the sins of backbiting or slander and the sin of pork eating. Amongst the believers or Muslims, there is a general perception that pork eating is a sin of higher intensity when compared with the sin of backbiting. So, most of us become emotional and start hating a person when we come to know that he or she eats pork. On the other hand, majority of us do not condemn a person who indulges in backbiting or slander. In fact, most of us commit the sin of backbiting in our day-to-day lives without even noticing it. Let us explore the true status of each of these two sins in the sight of God. I will evaluate the two sins in the light of wisdom provided by the glorious Quran that has been declared Kitabul Furqan in chapter 25, meaning a touchstone or criterion that judges right from wrong. First, I will refer to verses of Quran on the subject of pork eating or eating the flesh of swine. Chapter 5, verse 3 of Quran reads, "Prohibited for you are carrion, blood, the flesh of swine, for it is immoral." This verse explicitly declares that eating pork or flesh of swine is prohibited in Islam. The reason for this prohibition is also provided in this verse. It declares pork eating as an immoral act. So, any wise person who believes in one God and on the judgment day will avoid pork eating under all circumstances, for it is a sin that has been declared prohibited to highlight its gravity in the sight of God. On another occasion, chapter 2, verse 173 of Quran reads, "He has forbidden you carrion and blood and the flesh of swine. But if anyone is compelled without desiring or exceeding, he commits no sin. God is forgiving and merciful." This verse of Quran also explicitly prohibits eating pork or flesh of swine to reinforce the gravity of this sin to all human beings. However, since Islam is a pragmatic religion and it has to cater for all eventualities of life, therefore this verse also highlights the exception to the prohibition rule of pork eating. God declares that since He is the merciful God, therefore, if any human being eats flesh of swine under compulsion of hunger, he has committed no sin in the sight of God. This exception applies to situations where a hungry person has no other option to survive except to eat flesh of swine, probably in a jungle or wilderness. However, this exception does not apply to a situation where someone is traveling in a foreign country and he has multiple options of eating meat of other animals or vegetables or fruits, but he prefers to eat pork under any false pretext. We need to understand the fact that any prohibited act is a grave sin in the sight of God. Therefore, its commission may also result in a severe punishment on the judgment day. Since each human life has multiple dimensions, therefore God in His eternal wisdom also provides exceptions to strict rules to cater for limitations of human life. Such exceptions must be practiced within the parameters of extreme necessity. Otherwise, a grave punishment may be awarded to the sinner on the judgment day. Before examining the sin of backbiting or slander, we need to understand the proper meanings and context of this sin. The essentials of backbiting or slander may be summed up as follows. 1. It is a malicious talk or statement about another person. 2. The malicious talk or statement is not based on true or complete facts. 3. The other person is not present at the occasion to defend his or her position. 4. The objective is to tarnish the image or reputation of the absent person for any reason. The serious consequences of backbiting or slander may include 1. Loss of reputation of the person who is the subject of backbiting. 2. Animosity between that person and other individuals on the basis of false propaganda. 3. Humiliation and insult of the innocent person who is the subject of backbiting. All these consequences are extremely disliked by God, who alone knows the true moral character of each individual in totality. So human beings are warned that defaming any individual on the basis of your personal vendetta is not the approved way in the sight of God. It is a grave sin that one must avoid under all circumstances. Even backbiting shows one's own weak moral character. A backbiter does not possess the courage to advise or rebuke the person directly. Rather, he highlights his weakness in his absence in an exaggerated manner to satisfy his or her whims. So, a backbiter is a coward and a mean person. In this segment, I'm going to highlight the serious nature of the sin of backbiting or slander in the light of wisdom provided by the glorious Quran. Chapter 49, verse 12 of Quran reads, O you who believe, avoid most suspicion. Some suspicion is sinful, and do not spy on one another, nor backbite one another. Would any of you like to eat the flesh of his dead brother? You would detest it. In this verse, God educates human beings about the intensity of the sins of backbiting or slander. He evokes human conscience by declaring that the sin of backbiting is equal to eating the flesh of dead brother, the most abhorrent act on the part of any human being. The very thought of eating the flesh of one's dead brother is so repulsive that one may shudder. So God has compared the sin of backbiting with the sin of eating one's brother's flesh to warn heedful mankind. Unfortunately, majority of human beings ignore this warning of God in their day-to-day lives, and they remain indulged in the sin of backbiting or slander. The grave punishment for the sin of backbiting or slander is highlighted in chapter 104 verses 1 and 4 to 9 in the following words. Woe to every slanderer, backbiter. By no means he will be thrown into the crusher. And what will make you realize what the crusher is? God's kindled fire that laps to the hearts. It closes in on them in extended columns. These verses make it clear that there is a proclamation of distress and misery for every backbiter or slanderer. God declared that such a sinner will be thrown into the crusher in the hellfire, where his body will be crushed into dust and revamped again to be crushed again. The punishment for backbiting or slander is so grave that no prudent human being may ever commit it. It is not just confinement to the hellfire, but to the crusher, where besides burning, the human body will be crushed instantly and revamped again for further crushing and burning. The very thought of this punishment may jolt the conscience of any prudent person. Now I compare the two sins of backbiting and pork eating in terms of consequences in the light of wisdom provided by the glorious Quran. 1. Pork eating is a personal act that may or may not lead to health issues for human beings. However, it is an immoral act in the sight of God. 2. Backbiting or slander results in infringement of another person's general rights as member of a society. This act may result in defaming that person on the basis of a false propaganda against him. 3. So the consequences of pork eating are private in nature, while the consequences of backbiting or slander are public in nature. Therefore, backbiting or slander is a more grave sin than pork eating in terms of its consequences. Now I compare the two sins of backbiting and pork eating in terms of punishment reserved for these sins as proclaimed in the glorious Quran. 1. Pork eating may result in confinement to the hellfire on the judgment day, where human bodies will be burnt time and again as a punishment. 2. Backbiting or slander may result in being thrown into the crusher in the hellfire, where human bodies will be crushed and burned time and again as a punishment. 3. So the punishment for pork eating is comparatively of lower intensity when compared with the punishment for backbiting or slander. Now I sum up the key points of this monologue for reinforcement purpose. 1. Pork eating has been declared as a prohibited act that implies it is a grave sin in the sight of God. However, no specific punishment for pork eating is declared in Quran that implies that the punishment is known to God alone. It may be mere confinement in the hellfire with varying intensity. 2. Quran also describes one exception to the sin of pork eating, and this exception is that if someone eats pork to save his or her life, they have committed no sin in the sight of God. 3. Pork eating is a personal act of sin, and its consequences, both physical and spiritual, are restricted to the person committing that sin. It does not directly affect the life and reputation of other human beings. 4. Backbiting and slander are declared as grave sins too. However, the sins of backbiting or slander are so grave that God has compared it with eating the flesh of one's dead brother. God also commands that the act of eating flesh of one's dead brother is definitely the most loathsome act for any human being of conscience. 5. The punishment for a backbiter is categorically explained in the Quran to warn all prudent persons. This is the punishment of throwing the backbiter into the crusher. Crusher is that part of hell where the sinners will be burned and crushed time and again for their most heinous sins. 6. The sin of backbiting is not a personal act of sin. It is a sin that falls under the category of infringement of public rights. If such a sin is allowed to thrive, it may deteriorate the moral fabric of whole society. Where majority of people are indulged in the sin of backbiting or slander, the society can never be called a moral and coherent society where believers can live as a band of brothers. 7. In the light of wisdom provided by the glorious Quran, it is clear that the sin of backbiting is a sin of much higher intensity in terms of its consequences and punishment than the sin of pork eating. I conclude my monologue with a prayer that Allah Almighty may protect us from the commission of the sins of backbiting and pork eating. Please do subscribe my channel for updates. It's absolutely free.